The other sort of thread that's sort of really happening a lot these days is the understanding of competition versus cooperation. So biology used to have a very competitive sort of view of things. So you hear the phrases survival of the fittest or selfish genes that were common terms. But now, especially in the last 10, 15 years, people are realizing how absolutely important cooperation is between entities and forms of synergy, two things working together to do better than either of them could on their own. Variants of group selection where groups actually change not just by their individuals, and then multiple levels of selection where selection happens at many levels of the hierarchy turned out to be very important. And in fact, there have been 8 major transitions in the development of life, each of which is entities which used to be separate coming together and working together synergistically. So initially we had sort of replicating molecules in a soup, and cellular compartments came so that now some of those molecules came to work together and they formed a system. Independent replicators agglomerated into chromosomes. One of the big ones was the prokaryote to eukaryote transition. Every one of our cells in our body is full of mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own DNA. So every one of our mitochondria has its own DNA. It replicates and evolves independently. Some of its genes have migrated into our nuclear DNA, but the mitochondria are sort of like little separate creatures. It's not known whether our cells tried to eat the mitochondria and it ended up kind of becoming a parasite, or whether the mitochondria tried to invade those cells. But whichever way it happened, the two have come to form. And similarly for chloroplasts, and some people believe that the spiral sheets were separate organisms. And so the sort of synergy and the coming together has been sort of critical here. The development of sexual reproduction certainly has that. The development of multicellular organisms was one of the major transitions. And getting it so that the cells, like all of our cells, sort of work in harmony inside of us. Except occasionally one will sort of replicate on its own. We call that a cancer. And so we've, in order to develop multicellular organisms, we had to develop mechanisms whereby the sort of selfish action of individual cells is suppressed and the sort of good of the whole kind of. And so we're to the point now where if a skin cell falls off and dies, it's happy to do that for us because it has the same genes as the rest of our cells. And so the collective, sort of, our identity is attached to us as a collective. Solitary individuals form together into colonies, like the beehives and so on I mentioned, and into human groups of various scales, and then human language served as the next level. So these are the major 8 transitions which have happened to where we are, and they all came from this synergistic effects. And in fact, there have been 3 books just in the last decade or so, which really point out that it used to be thought that evolution was this sort of random process, but in fact, evolution has a direction. That we certainly see a general trend from simple organisms to more complex. And in fact, it's the synergies, it's the non-zero-sum games, that's why this is called non-zero. It's the opportunities in the world for 2 entities to cooperate together and create something they couldn't do separately. That's what drives evolution. That's what pushes it in a certain direction. And so, in some sense, it gives us some teleonomy or some purpose or some meaning, though exactly what it is something that has to be ferreted out. And I would recommend these books as quite interesting for understanding that. The beehive is sort of an interesting example to kind of get more insight into the cooperative nature. Individual bees can't survive on their own. If they get separated from the hive, they die. So in some sense, the bee isn't the animal. The beehive is really the animal. And it's a warm-blooded animal. If the temperature gets too cold, then the bees start shivering, sort of just like we shiver to raise the temperature, and they raise the temperature of the hive. If it gets too warm, some of the bees go out and they find water, and they spread water over it, and it evaporates, and so it's a form of sweating. So you can kind of see the hive is sort of starting to develop a kind of physiology of its own. The casts, there are bees of different forms. There are worker bees, there's the queen bee. Those are sort of analogous to the different organs in a multicellular organism like us. The queen is sort of like the ovaries of the animal. The different bee types are like cell types. The decision-making of the beehive, the bees sort of shake and they dance on the hive, and that sort of looks very much like neural activation. If a bee kind of goes and gets some pollen and comes back, he tries to give it off to the workers in the hive that use that pollen to feed the babies and so on. And if they take the pollen vigorously, then he gets all excited and he dances. Just like in the brain, if you have an idea which is really working, the neurons get excited and you see a lot of activation. And if a bee starts dancing, more other bees start following him. And so you get this general process whereby discoveries which are being successful for the needs of the colony lead to more of that getting done. And that's the way the hive sort of thinks. That's the kind of beehive cognition. Hives reproduce sort of like mitosis, like cells split. At some point, a new queen will be born, and she'll fly off, and half the hive will go with her. So it's sort of like a cell splitting the two. There's a beautiful book that just came out on the superorganism, looking at the insect societies, and it's fascinating to see how their behaviors sort of reflect on human behaviors. There's often conflict between sort of, as the group forms, the group begins to get intentions of its own. So there are sort of actions which are good for the good of the group, and those may or may not be aligned with the interests of the individuals that make up that group. And so in particular, from the perspective of an individual, it may be a good thing to fight with your neighbor and try and steal some of his resources. Me as an individual, I can maybe do better by doing that. From the group's perspective, if two of its members are fighting, that's a waste of resources. It doesn't actually help the group as a whole. It just shifts resources from one to the other. And so it's in the group's interest for its members to cooperate with one another. And so groups tend to create mechanisms to enhance cooperation. They also apply pressure. They apply evolutionary pressure on the members of that group, so that if you're doing things that are not in the interest of the group will develop mechanisms and structures that tend to penalize you, and that hurts you evolutionarily. And so over time, the interests of the group come to be reflected in the individuals of that group. And so you can kind of think of it as group mind is kind of sort of downloading into the individual mind. But usually that only happens partially. So, yeah.
I just wondered if what happened 50,000 years ago could be applied to modern society, to the fact that the Neanderthals, there were two human evolutionary states, existing at the same time, in Africa. Yeah, the Neanderthals blocked the exits of Africa, so that's the reason why Europe had a very sparse population of the more advanced human beings, because they were afraid of traversing these exits. That's another book, I forgot, I can give you the reference. That's very interesting because, here we have, something like more advanced intelligence that cannot physically, they were physically inferior, but more advanced intellectually. They wanted to spread out and populate more parts of the world, but they couldn't, because there were these Neanderthals that were like beating them up with big clubs and everything. So
you're talking about population bottlenecks being a force.
Yeah, right. So how this applies now, because we will also face in the future where there will be different levels of intelligence.
Yeah, and I'll get to that as we go. That one can also be thought of as competition between groups. So you start to think of the group as an organism where you can have groups of the same form, or in the case of Neanderthals and humans, groups of different forms that compete with one another, and some of the competitive aspects then sort of apply forces on each. But yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. So here's just the point. In order to make multicellular organisms work, cancer is a danger. Individual cells replicating more than they should. We had to develop immune systems. Immune systems are a way to suppress the sort of selfish replication of individual cells. In order to make human society work, the danger is individuals, go around stealing stuff rather than, earning it themselves. And so we had to create mechanisms like police systems and court systems to suppress that. You can sort of think of the bee as having his mind has sort of two forces on it. He's got his own individual interests. He wants to survive as a bee. He wants to eat the right amount of food. He wants to do the right thing. On the other hand, he also wants to make his hive do well. And the interests of the hive have been incorporated into the bee's little brain. And in fact, bees will sacrifice themselves. They'll sting you to their own until they die for the sake of the hive. And so you can kind of think of bee mind and hive mind. And people have that as well, I believe, that we certainly have a sort of egoic side. You can almost think of it as good versus evil. The society has an interest to promote those things which help society. And so it tends to label those things which are in one's selfish interest. It labels those as bad. And it's created all kinds of structures to encourage the social good. And there have been, there's a great psychologist, Haidt, who's studied what he calls the moral emotions, which are our internal emotional states which tend to push us toward doing things which are for the good of society. And he studied, analyzed a whole bunch of things, and he's found that there are 5 basic moral emotions.